Hello and welcome to this new webinar organized by Natixis Research CIB. Today's webinar is on gallium and germanium, the recent news, that was announced on the 1st of July about export controls from China on those two metals. We'll be discussing today. So I'm Bernard Dahdah from Research. I'm in charge of metals and mining, and joining me today, Sylvain Eckert, senior industry banker, ex-mining engineer. So you have two hats, hard hat today, and your soft hat from your time as a project finance business, more front office type of banking work. It's probably worth, Sylvain, discussing just to start to contextualize how the announcement was made. And maybe we can then deep dive into those two minor metals and what it means for the market. So first week of July, Chinese government announces export controls. So it's important to note that there are not export bans, as some people have been muddling up. And basically the argument was that it's been done to protect, and I quote, protect national security and interests. So this decision has been widely perceived as part of a wider tit-for-tat battle that's been ongoing for a few years now between the Western Bloc and China, trying to hinder each other's technological advances, especially when it comes to microchips. So those two metals are important, as we'll discuss, in the production of microchips. It seems that this announcement by the Chinese came just a few days after the Dutch government announced that they will be putting export restriction on specific machinery made by ASML, which is machinery related to chip making for ultraviolet lithography machinery, which allows for the production of the most state-of-the-art and most advanced chips. So that's the context we're in. It's important to note also that when it comes to Chinese imports of microprocessors and chips, they import more in terms of nominal value than they do import oil. So that's how big a deal it is for China, for the West, whoever has the fastest microchips, and then Sylvain will explain the advantage they give compared to silicon, I guess, which is a substitute, not as performance. So we're talking about weapons, we're talking about chips for cars, for aircrafts, for satellites, etc. Sylvain, the first question I think that's worth digging is coming from the mineral side of things. So what are minor metals?
So thank you, Bernard, and thanks for having me. So we've displayed the official list of minor metals as laid out by the MMTA, the Minor Metals Trade Association. But generally speaking, a minor metal is a metal which is not produced as a primary metal, but as a byproduct of a base metal production. And you generally can find specifically germanium and gallium as byproduct of some zinc ore, or in the case of germanium and sometimes gallium, and in the case of gallium from bauxite ore. Their markets are very small and since they are very small, they are very volatile. Over the past 5 or let's say the past 10 years, the minimum yearly average price for gallium was under $250 per kilo, and the highest price was above $650 or $750 per kilo. So you can see the range or the volatility of the price that it goes. But overall, the market are small. We're talking about 350 to 400 tons for gallium, 140 tons for germanium. So markets in the range of $300 to $400 million each. So very small market.
So combined, we're talking about less than a billion.
Yes, less than a billion combined. The price I mentioned are subject to discussions or subject to questioning, because those metals are not traded on an exchange. So the price discovery mechanism can be quite opaque, and most of these minor metals are used in very specialized and high-tech application, and as Bernard alluded to, notably in the defense and telecommunication area.
So do you want to go back to the Mendeleev table?
No, that's fine.
Okay, cool. If we look at gallium, so we're talking about 350 tons, 400 tons a year you were mentioning. Its usage is mainly, we're talking about lighting, but also integrated circuits, which goes back to the argument about China specifically targeting those two elements. Can gallium be substituted?
The thing with gallium is that it has a much stronger resistance to heat compared with silicon. So microchip with a gallium nitride or gallium arsenic substrate can be used in applications that dissipate a lot of heat by minimizing the space. A good example is the cell phones. As the frequency or as the generation of 4G, 5G are emerging, you need to have chips that will commute at a higher rate, and gallium is quite essential in those applications, but as well in power applications and in some defense applications. Germanium is used in infrared optics, okay, for weapon systems. But also in fiber optics, so has also a role to play in communication. There's also applications in the LED and emerging applications in photovoltaics. It's much more effective in the development of PV panels to use gallium wafers. But the cost is quite prohibitive, so for the time being it's reserved to some very specialized application. But that's something that's ramping up quite quickly. Yeah.
So I understand that basically you can substitute gallium and germanium in those for most applications.
Yeah.
Except that you lose some performance.
You lose some performance when you substitute.
And the price is relatively the same.
And the price doesn't. It's not a matter of price; it's a matter of performance. And there are some applications in the defense industry where there's very little substitution possible.
Okay, like I understand also solar panels for satellites where you cannot replace
because they're more effective. Price doesn't
Very good. Sorry, I forgot to mention also that for those of you who want to ask questions, please feel free to type them in the chat question, and we'll answer the questions at the end of our little discussion. So Sylvain, why do you think, from all the panoply of metals that China controls, so if you look at this chart here by the European Commission, it's for 2020. You can look at the right-hand side, you see that China pretty much controls that a wide panoply of minor metals and rare earth elements. So why specifically today are they targeting gallium and germanium?
Yes, good question. Gallium and germanium is just one step or one more pattern or one more step of China to try and control some value chains in certain metals. They've done it across a number. I mean, the map that you displayed, Bernard, speaks for itself. They are becoming, or they have become predominant across a number of strategic or critical metals, and across the minor metals that we display, they're controlling pretty much all of the Mendeleev tables, one way or another. And when I say one way or another, that is, it's not always the same bottleneck that is being used to control the production of metal. Sometimes it's the extraction, sometimes it's the processing, sometimes it's the refining. And I know that beyond what is being produced in China, there's also some level of controls by Chinese companies overseas. Like if you take Brazil niobium, so 92% of niobium is produced out of Brazil, out of 2 mines. One of them is controlled by a large Chinese company. But why germanium and gallium were targeted this time? I think it was in a direct answer to the microchip emerging wars that you are alluding to in the introduction. Today, officially, last year, the EU sourced 71% of its gallium and 45% of its germanium from China. Maybe that's not the latest number, but if you look at
that's the exposure.
Yeah, that's the exposure. But if you look at a 5-year average, it's actually more than 70% for germanium and 80% for gallium. Something of note is that if you look at the history of germanium and gallium production, in both cases, there are some strong differences from one year to another. I mean, the pattern of production of these metals across countries does vary quite a lot over a relatively short period of time. But we'll get back to that crisis of the predominance of China in those metals and the leverage that they could get from that predominance was foreseeable already some time ago. Of note, and we'll go back to that as well, is that that has not always been the case. And up until recently, there was germanium production in Europe, notably in Germany and in Finland, but we'll get back to that.
So on that note, basically, there's a certain point where, back in 2010, I think, there's been several instances where China has tried to leverage rare earth elements or minor metals to its advantage for one reason or another. I think the most notable one was in 2010 when Japan had an issue with Japan surrounding some islands. Japan, I think at the time, 95% of its rare earth elements came from China. And since then, they've been able to reduce their exposure to China to something like 55%. It's taken them 10 years, and they've been able to diversify away by buying from other countries. Now, it is a closed-loop system. China produces overwhelmingly those metals, so it's not like every country in the world can diversify right now from China. But the question I'm going to try and ask you is was this crisis, if we can call it the crisis yet, because as we'll discuss later, it's probably not as a massive deal as it could have been with other metals, but was it predictable? You know, I mentioned already that probably yes, given that they've already tinkered around with some other metals, but was it avoidable? I mean, how can we get out of it? And that goes to the essence of the conversation that will be had. How can Western countries reclaim sovereignty over those two metals? Do we have the know-how? Do we have the minerals? First of all, maybe you can explain to us that actually for those minor minerals, actually we don't mine them as per se.
Yeah, so there's quite a few questions, Bernard, but I'll try maybe to start by telling the tale of one gallium producer in Europe who've published its own account of the events that ultimately led him to close their capacity in Germany. So what they're telling us is that in 2010, the gallium was equally produced from the CIS country, China and Europe. The market was smaller than it is today. It was 175 tons, so roughly half of what it is today. And during that period, so from 2010, the capacities of China in China were drastically increased. But when I mean drastically, it's drastically. So today's market is 350 tons roughly. At that point in time, so more than 10 years ago, China developed enough capacities so that the overall production capacity of the world went from less than 200 tons to more than 700 tons. In 2014, China produced 500 tons of gallium, without a corresponding need anywhere in the world, and certainly not in their own country. As a result, the price of gallium did drop extremely sharply, and I said the minimum yearly average price for gallium went under $250 per kilo, but at some point it did drop to below $100 a kilo, which still is well under the production cost of a number of Western suppliers, and probably well under the production cost of Chinese suppliers. So naturally, at that point in time, pretty much all production capacity elsewhere in the world was wiped out quite instantly. You can tell from the production curve of gallium that between 2014 and 2015, basically China took over more than 90% of gallium production everywhere in the world. And good news, the second largest producer was Russia, and the third largest producer was Ukraine, which leaves us, as of today, in a situation where essentially China is the only source of gallium for the Western world, and they have still plenty of over capacity that they could restart if the price were to rise.
That capacity is basically in Europe and the US. I think you mentioned the example of Germany as being a producer of gallium.
Yes.
Historically, but my understanding is that because of the dumping that took place from China, and the fact that there wasn't really a price incentive there, if we want to reestablish this network for gallium and germanium, for each of those metals, what do we need to do?
So
if you start with with germanium, maybe
it's actually two sides, two things to answer the question. The first one is technical, and the second one is economical. So I'll start with the technical one. Resource availability. Resource availability is not really an issue. Not every bauxite deposit contains sufficient
for germanium. Germanium?
For bauxite, for gallium, but
okay, sorry.
and for germanium, not every zinc zinc deposit does contain germanium. But there are identified deposits of zinc and of bauxite as well that do contain a substantial amount of these elements, including in European countries. At some point, France was a leading producer. I'm talking 50 years ago, but France was a leading producer of germanium. With the mines of Saint-Salvi, and there are still in the BRGM inventaire year of 1992 a number of zinc mines where germanium as byproduct has been earmarked as potential. I got the good news for you. One of the largest germanium mines ever producing on the planet is on the verge of reopening. It's labeled as a zinc mine for the time being, but when we looked at where there were alternative sources of germanium and gallium, it so appears that Kipushi type deposit could be a good source of zinc plus both of these metals. It so happens that Kipushi, which was an historical producer, is now planned for restart in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we're back to the question as to how do we accompany those developing countries to open or to become partners when it comes to raw material supply. So that's part of that's part of resource availability. So not really a problem. Work needs to be done, but one can find.
And for gallium?
And for gallium, there are databases published by the USGS, so the United States Geological Survey, that does mention bauxite deposit with high level of gallium. So the Chinese bauxite are generally higher in gallium than the rest of the world, which I explain as well why China becomes so predominant. But it so happens that I think that most of the Mediterranean basin bauxite, which are karst-type bauxite, may contain some elevated level of gallium. I think the highest gallium grade ever recorded in a sample was somewhere in Turkey.
Okay, so generally speaking, from what my understanding is, the supply chain does exist in Europe.
Well, the
just not economically.
The resource availability does exist for Europe. I shouldn't say in Europe, but does exist for Europe. Now there are a number of people that made announcement that they were considering reopening germanium and gallium projects. Nearstar made an announcement on the 4th of July. Boliden made an announcement at a conference that they had been looking into a germanium recovery circuit at one of their smelters in Finland, and there is a gallium recovery circuit at Stade Alumina, plus there's one that was developed by Ron Poulenc in Australia. So these do exist. So it's not flicking the switch, but at the same time, it's not as complicated to add a recovery circuit on an existing smelter or an existing alumina refinery as to develop a lithium mine from scratch, for example, in Europe. So reaction time, I mean, it's not going to be exactly realistic, but the reaction time could be much quicker than reopening mines. The second facet of the question is economical, and that's where you wanted to bring me, Bernard. But there was production of gallium and germanium in Europe. Today, the question is, if we do reopen capacity with the overhang of capacity in China, Chinese producer could flood the market again, have the price drop, and we are not more advanced. So there's a question to be asked to the end users, to the governments, as to whether these metals are strategic enough so that they can support investment for recovery circuit for these metals via the pricing mechanism, essentially.
And that's one of the things, is when you think about it, you're saying that the market of both of them is something like $800 million, but overwhelmingly they're going towards a market that's worth hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, which is the microprocessor market. So it's hard for me to come and say there's X cents worth of gallium or germanium, or X amount of gallium and germanium, nominally speaking, in microprocessors, but we can insinuate, given the size of that market, that it's minute, infinitely minute, to the profit margins.
I wouldn't go as far as infinitely.
But that's not the most important. It's not the biggest costs part of their cost structure. And I guess what the Chinese were doing, probably offering them at prices of 20-30% discount. So the choice they have here is, would I prefer to have security of sourcing at a cost that's higher? So do I lock myself and allow for producers to have an offtake? Well, do I agree on an offtake, even though it would cost me more from the Chinese, well, likely to dump, but I get a secure source for something that at the end of the day doesn't seem to be the biggest cost component.
Yeah,
although it's like vital, it's a vital part of the production.
It's about incentivizing. Restart of production, and incentivizing is possibly incentivizing for the investment phase, but also by providing visibility over sufficiently long time over the profitability of the business. As you said, the cost of the raw material is a minor portion of the microchip. I should add that the value chains are not as simple as we may infer. You're extracting germanium or gallium from bauxite and zinc. China export gallium and germanium, but you need further refining step to bring it to a quality that's sufficient for use in microchip, and that occurs largely outside of China for that matter.
So you mentioned the cycle of we produce in the West, China comes and produces at a much lower cost, potentially subsidized by the state, if I may add. My take on it is that with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the CHIPS Act, with the CRMA, with NZIA, with the Russia-Ukraine war, it does seem to me that we are past the really capitalistic model of I will go as a consumer, I will go to the cheapest option. I would rather secure or guarantee my supply. So do we assume that this cycle is going to has ended or is going to end? And that's my question that ties into what role do you think we have in Europe when it comes to those funds that were recently announced, those critical or strategic raw material funds, be it in France, be it in Germany, be it in Italy. How can they contribute towards securing the supply for those consumers in the West?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I will start to note that those funds that have been earmarked have a slightly different functioning compared to this one, like Japan. JOGMEC does stockpiling and does some form of price, not regulation, but has more capacity when it comes to absorbing shocks compared to what those funds are supposed to do. But certainly securing raw material supply for strategic industries falls fully in their scope. For them to invest into those recovery projects or recovery circuits or etc. We're back to the same question. The end users or the government will have to incentivize investment into those recovery circuits. So through price management. I mean, for end user, it's going to be a trade-off at the end of the day. Do I want to take the benefit of potential drop in the price at the expense of not having the material and not having the capacity to produce, or do I give some price certainty over to the producer so that they can supply me over the long term steadily and with some visibility on the cost, which should be beneficial to all parties actually.
So I'm conscious about time and that we might have some questions. So just as a conclusion, we talked here about slightly more the long-term optic of things, which is about, yes, we can restart in Europe, we have the experience, we have the knowledge. After all, especially for gallium, it's not like we have to mine ore, we're sourcing it already from bauxite, already being so they're byproducts of widely available minerals that are present in the Western world. On a nearer term basis, in terms of the issue that we're facing, at least my take is, and I don't know what you'll have to add on, is I wouldn't be as stressed as potentially some other metals. A, there are substitutes that exists, albeit at lower performance. B, the Chinese have given until 1st of October until they introduce the export controls, so we can see some stocking up taking place potentially. Third point would be saying again, it's export control. It's hard to say, it's not exactly an export ban. Now it remains to be seen how they'll play around with it, and if they want to put an complete export ban. Because we could potentially see some rerouting, the same way we saw with some other Russian metal towards other countries. I mean, China would have to put a complete export ban on those two metals to ensure that those metals don't reach the West if they don't want them to reach the West. There's also an important point that I think is that stockpiles by those companies seem to already exist. It's hard to say, depending on which country, for how long they'll have stockpiles. There are even some strategic stockpiles from some countries, like the US, announced recently that they already had stockpiles of germanium. That was his Pentagon spokesman that announced it a few weeks ago, but not of germanium. It's worth noting. So on the short term, I don't think the production will, at least production of microprocessors will be impacted directly or immediately because of those potential stockpiles that I imagine those companies have. But if you have any other thoughts you might want to add on the nearer term rather than the longer term of restarting the production, because that.
No, but yeah, in the short term, it's about stockpiling, and we don't know for sure how many strategic stockpile, because it's a defense-related industry, so you can safely assume that there are some, and the amounts are quite small. So you can safely assume that a number of countries have stockpiles of, and a number of existing producers have stockpiles of germanium and gallium to some extent. Time will tell, because as you say, it's not a full ban for the time being, but more showing the strengths and in a manner that's been done before, that we can expect on some other commodities in the near future. Recycling is going, development of recycling is going to be a key factor in the.
So my understanding for recycling is that was it germanium? I think is 30%. We get of germanium that's recycled, yeah. But gallium there is no recycling. Is it economically uninteresting?
Well, it will all back to the economics of production of these things. So gallium is recycled at the production plants, but it's not recovered from end user and materials and recycled for the time being. I can't tell you about the economics of recycling of gallium, but yeah, go back to the question of economics and whether it's economic to recover gallium from spent ICTs.
So we have one question which talks about what about geographic split of gallium supply? Is it similar to that of germanium?
No, they are quite different. The raw supply, the supply of germanium, the gallium in the ore for gallium is quite concentrated in China, in Chinese bauxites. For germanium, it comes a little bit from all over the from various zinc production that are making their way into China, where it's extracted by the zinc smelters.
Okay, I don't know if that's about it in terms of questions. Just one last point, maybe, Sylvain. I don't know if you have any other things you might want to add. I mean, the way I look at it also is from a geopolitical perspective, from what we saw with gas, with Russia, they played the card of having so much control on Europe that meant that Europe diversified away from Russia. If Europe is heading towards, with the IRA and with those protectionist measures and the wake-up call that we've seen towards energy security and mineral securitization, do we end up in a situation which is more complicated going forward, because this is the last time that China can potentially use to its advantage in terms of economic pressure to use the fact that they control 100% of minor, 100 or 90% of minor metals? Or
yeah, I don't think it's going to be the last time we will see that.
No, I mean, if within 4 years' time Europe diversifies away, so I mean that brings the question of rare earth elements.
Yeah, so the good proxy is the rare earth elements, but I mean everyone comes to the realization that our supply chains for metals are quite dependent on very few countries or on single countries in most cases, so that will change in the years to come. But the pattern has been has been always the same, and I mean the crisis of rare earth was at the same point as we are today with the germanium and gallium, 2010, so 13 years ago. What did it lead to? It did lead to the reopening of rare earth mines in the US, and we have plenty of rare earth projects that are now almost ready for production. Some of them producing in Australia with separation plants in Malaysia, etc., etc. So it did lead to less less reliance for the mining of rare earths into China. Unfortunately, all the separation today still occurs in China. So the concentrate from the US mine goes to China for the separation of the various rare earths that can be then reported for.
Is it more complicated to refine rare earth elements than it is for minor metals?
Well, it depends which minor metals, but no, but it doesn't get less complicated than rare earths. I mean, the reason being that the rare earths they all come together, as you can imagine. If you see, it shows the Mendeleev table. If they all come together, it's because they have very similar chemical behavior. And when you want to separate chemical elements that do have a very similar behavior, it does get quite complicated, and more complicated than separate, I don't know, what, cobalt from copper or molybdenum from something else. So yeah, but the message is that controlling a value chain means controlling all of the value chain, or debottlenecking all of the value chain, not only the extraction portion, but also the refining and the manufacturing of intermediate products that eventually are going to be used by the industries that you're trying to re-onshore in Europe. A good example is the battery value chain that we've talked about at length. Whereas the rare earths also is quite interesting, because we need the rare earths for permanent magnets for EVs and renewable energy. We start to have the first project that will be able to enable the production of rare earths in Europe. So 10, 13 years down the road, and we could expect that in those past 13 years, Europe took its time to come to the realization that securing supply chain was important, and could have acted faster. So now, if you take the list of critical metals that are produced in China, you get gallium, germanium. But if I had a crystal ball, I'd say watch out for silicon metal.
That brings to the question someone is asking here, which is, given the likely low impact of this export restriction on Western countries for gallium and germanium, it's like a warning shot. Which CRMs could they target in the future for export restrictions, and which metals do we think would be harder to replace supply? So I just interrupted you in the right moment of your train of thought.
So I mean, we can.
Because you're mentioning silicon. What were you mentioning?
Silicon metal. The reason being that there was some month ago a deficit of silicon metal on the market, and China did plan and did start to ramp up their capacity of silicon metal production extremely sharply, notably for solar PV manufacturing. There's thought now not to be. I mean, there's bans on supplying from polysilicon from China in the US presently, and there's talk to develop the similar industry in Europe. Guess what? If you expose those projects to the market price, or if the solar PV manufacturing plant do look for the cheapest option to supply the raw material, they will end up in supplying from China at the expense of the newly developed projects in Europe at a much cheaper cost. But one day they will face potential restriction on export, and will not be in a situation where they can supply their key raw material. Graphite is an interesting one. Today, 100% of graphite that you need in every single battery for your electric vehicles is manufactured in China. There are stocks to develop lithium, nickel and cobalt production out of Europe. Very little has been done on the graphite. That's another key bottleneck, and I could go on and take pretty much every metal that is present there. And on some of them, the cycle of already gone through the cycle, meaning all the Western producers have been wiped out. In others, it's in the process of happening. It's just a matter of planification and industrial policy. At the end of the day, you want to have industrial plants that generates jobs, that generates value add, etc., in Europe. Then you need to support the supply chain and to have an industrial policy which will enable those industries, those profitable and value-added industries, to secure their supply one way or another. So it's a matter of having an industrial, steady and long-term industrial policy and determine what we do want to do in Europe to support those industries.
So yeah, I guess my take on it would be if they wanted to widen the spectrum of areas where they could hit outside of the microprocessor area, electric vehicles would be a great place for them to head Europe for the West.
They started,
as you mentioned.
They're banning export of graphite to Sweden, where the first big factory of Europe is being developed.
Last question we'll take, I'm conscious about time. If possible to do so, how many years will be necessary before the Western countries might be independent from China regarding CRMs? Yes, the answer is it depends on which metals.
Yeah, it depends on which metals, but the answer it's a long-term planning.
Long-term as in a decade at least.
At least a decade.
For all the metals.
For most of the metals.
Yeah. Yeah.
So some will go quicker. I mean, lithium, I can imagine that sovereignty over lithium supply could be reestablished in Europe within 4 to 5 years. That doesn't mean autonomy, that means sovereignty, having found sufficiently diversified sources of supply from allied countries or friendly countries.
Thanks a lot for your time. I'm conscious we're just on time. We're finishing just on time. So thanks a lot for your attention. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to contact Sylvain Eckert or myself, Bernard Dahdah. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.